thank you for that really nice introduction. I'm just going to turn this around so I can use my slides. Hopefully not unplug anything. So thanks so much for being here this morning. Thanks for spending your nice Saturday morning with us. We don't often get this nice weather on the weekends recently. So yeah, I'm Julie-Lynn. I work with PEI Fish and Wildlife, and I'm here to talk about PEI's forest and wetlands as biodiversity hotspots. So when you think of wetlands, these kind of images might come to mind, like an open water pond, a marshy area, or a bog. These are all wetlands. And just to provide a bit of a definition of wetlands in PEI, they're areas that have hydric soils, so soils that are saturated, flooded, or ponded long enough during the growing season that anaerobic conditions appear in the upper part of the soil. So that means there's changes in the microbes in the soil or soil chemistry, and it changes colors, and when you put a soil auger in, you can see those redoxomorphic features in the soil. It also has to have wetland vegetation or hydrophytic vegetation, so these are plants that are adapted to living in wet soils. And it also has to have wetland hydrology, so some kind of clue that there is hydrology in the area, and that may be water-stained leaves or very clear drainage patterns. And so to be called a wetland in PEI, you have to have all three of these features. It's kind of like a three-legged stool. You need all three of these for it to be called a wetland. So what is a forested wetland? Well, a forested wetland has all of those three features. It has hydric soils, the hydrophytic vegetation, and those hydromorphic or hydrology features, but they have a forest canopy. So they're unique wetland ecosystems that combine both a wetland and a forest component. So they either have a shrub or forest cover. And so some examples of PEI that you're probably quite familiar with. We've got red maple swamps, so things like they would have cinnamon fern, sphagnum moss. There's black spruce sort of swamps. They've got lots of different shrubs, but often Labrador tea and sphagnum moss. And then there's sort of a mixed coniferous wet forest type, which is larch and black spruce with sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss is a bit of a theme. There's alder thickets, which I know is sometimes the bane of woodlot owners, but they are very important for wildlife. And in Western PEI, we have kind of a unique wetland, forested wetland type in cedar swamps, which you likely won't find very much of, or at least naturally, in Eastern PEI. They're very interesting and special places for PEI. And I mentioned sphagnum moss. This is a really good indicator of wetlands, and so this is whenever you go into a forest and you see that big thick mat of moss that looks like it'd be really nice to take a nap on. This is what I'm talking about. It's got this almost like a firework kind of top. It looks like at the top there, a little burst of vegetation, and this is a really good indicator of wetland. That's often what you'll find as growing right on the ground. And it is really great to take a nap on. I can tell you that. And just a shout out to vernal pools. They're not permanent wetlands, but they are temporary shallow pools that form. They're kind of characterized by flooding and then drying out. And they are very important for our amphibian species. And so salamanders and frogs, they go and lay their eggs there in the spring. And they're often found in forested wetland complexes. So where you've got lots of forested wetland, you'll often have these little pools that will dry out throughout the season. And this photo is from Victoria Park, of the spotted salamander here. I'm sure you're all familiar with Dead Man's Pond in the center of Victoria Park. So this photo I took at about 11 p.m. one night, early in the spring, a couple of years ago. That pond is actually super important for amphibians in the urban area of Charlottetown. At that point, I was standing there, and it was very quiet because it was 11 p.m. and no one else was in Victoria Park at that hour. But all you could hear was little feet crinkling on leaves, and you really couldn't step anywhere around you because if you did, you might step on a salamander. There were thousands of them all going into this pond to lay their eggs. So these areas, although they're quite small, they're super important for those amphibian species like salamanders and frogs. So forested wetlands are biodiversity hotspots in PEI, and there's lots of reasons for that. One being These areas weren't great for farming, so a lot of them have not been plowed under, so they still have that native seed bank. So when I say plowed under, I mean they haven't been turned into fields over time, they've been left, that soil has not been disturbed. And so there's a lot of native seeds still stored in the soil, and so you often get lots of rare plants. There's also, they also have very high humidity. So the wet soil and then all of that canopy cover and then the shrub layer kind of locks in moisture. And you'll notice when you walk into a forested wetland, the temperature really drops and it gets a lot cooler and you can kind of feel the wetness in the air. And that's super important for things like some of the lichens that we'll talk about. So these are conditions that really support lichens and lots of different kinds of rare lichens. So the humidity piece is quite important for them. There's high complexity in forested wetlands, so both on the forest floor, because they've never been plowed, or a lot of them haven't been plowed, they still have that pit and mound topography, so you'll find little hummocks and then little dips. And that's really important to create sort of micro topography for different species that need different conditions. So the forest floor is very complex, lots of opportunities for birds and other species to find shelter, to make nests, to hide from predators. And then as you move up, there's a very complex shrub layer often because of those wet conditions. So you get lots of opportunities for birds to be foraging in the shrubs and other species as well to be making their homes there. And then as you keep going up in the forest canopy, often there's lots of standing deadwood, which is also very important for cavity nesters, and also for birds to use as song perches. So lots of birds are singing for their mate, and they like to get above the canopy so that they can project out into the forest. So all that complexity is really important for wildlife, and there's a lot of it in forested wetlands. There's also an abundant insect prey, so there's lots of water in these areas, obviously, but a lot of our insects actually start their life in the water. And so they're very, if you've ever been in one, you know there's lots of bugs, which maybe isn't great for us, but it's very important for the wildlife that live there, for the birds and the bats, and the amphibians and other species. So even though forested wetlands occupy a very small amount of space on our landscape, about 2.2% of all PEI's land base, it actually represents habitat for 70% of our forest-associated species at risk. So it's a very, very small amount of land that provides a lot of habitat for a lot of species that aren't doing so well. So I'll go through some of the species at risk you might find in forested wetlands. I mostly work on species at risk projects, so that's why a large focus of this is species at risk. The first one is wrinkled shingle lichen, great little tongue twister. It's often found on the edges of wetlands, and there's only a few, for each of these species, there's only a few known locations on PEI. And before 2020, we didn't even know about some of these species. Through some research with the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center, we've found that we've got a number of rare lichen species, so we're working to protect those. So wrinkled shingle lichen often grows on the edges of wetlands on trees that are mature, that have like rough bark that they can kind of cling to. There's also blue felt lichen, which is found only in Miss Bush Bog in PEI. It's the only known location that we know of here in PEI. And white-rimmed shingle lichen, another tongue twister. I love lichen names, they're kind of fun. There's also one called frosted glass whiskers, which I thought might be fun to tell you about. It's not found in forested wetland, but it's just got a fun name. It's a stubble lichen, so it looks like it's called a stubble lichen because it's very small, and it looks like a beard stubble. That's about the same size. So you really need like a magnifying glass to be able to find it. Moving on from lichens, we've got bat species at risk. We have the little brown bat and northern myotis. And so these are endangered species here in PEI. They're endangered because of the white nose syndrome, which is a fungal disease that was introduced to North America in the early 2000s. It first showed up in New York in a cave that was frequented by tourists and has spread across North America. And it actually wakes the bat up during their hibernation. And they wake up in the winter and there's no food for them and they end up starving. And it's created it's created a huge population decline. Bats have declined by about 95% in this region. And little brown bat is showing some early signs of recovery. Their populations have stabilized, but we now think that maybe the northern long-eared bat or northern myotis may be locally extinct here in PEI. We're still doing some more research with the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, but there is a possibility that it may no longer be here And the thing with bats is that it takes a long time for them to recover. They only rear one young a year. So for them to get back to that population level will take likely beyond my lifetime. So these species use forested wetlands, like I mentioned. Forested wetlands are they're great insect-producing habitats, and of course bats will eat insects while they're flying, and so you'll find them there foraging and also roosting. And then we have lots of bird species at risk, which is really more my wheelhouse. I'm a birder. So we've got lots of wetlands, or birds that are found in forested wetlands. We have olive-sided flycatcher, which is our biggest flycatcher. You'll often see them sitting on the tops of trees singing, and they'll fly and swoop down and catch their insect prey in the air. They're in like beaver meadows, kind of more open forested wetlands. They're visual feeders, so they like to be able to see their prey. We have rusty blackbird, which is not actually all that common in PEI. Their call is kind of like a rusty window opening. And they're in beaver meadows and wet areas across the island, but again, not very common. And then we have Canada warbler, which is the species I'm most familiar with. I did my master's on Canada warbler and olive-sided flycatcher, and I'll show you a figure from that in my next slide. But these birds are little warblers. They're usually the last to arrive at their breeding territories here in PEI. And they really like forested wetlands for breeding. They are ground nesters, so they'll nest on the ground in forested wetlands, often where there's a little hump of moss or an old log or in a bundle of ferns. They'll create their nests in there. They forage in the shrub layer, so that shrub layer is really important, and they're also one of those birds that are up singing on the song perches to attract a mate. And so this is a figure from my master's research that I finished in 2020, and I'll just explain it here for you. So each point on this graph represents a bird community, and so we had sites from Alberton Harbor all the way over to Surrey Line Road, so we had surveys across PEI. And so each point on the map, let me move this so I can speak to you. Each point on the map represents a bird community, and this test actually groups bird communities that are similar closer together. So if a point is close to another point, that means the bird community was similar. They are color-coded, so the green ones had 0 species of conservation concern. The lighter blue had 1 species of conservation concern. The kind of purple or darker blue had 2, and the red had 3 species of conservation concern present at that site. And then you'll notice there are triangles, and there's 1 square up there. The triangles are sites where we had Canada warbler, and then the square is where we had 1 olive-sided flycatcher. I didn't get a lot of results for olive-sided flycatcher. They weren't easy to find. And so this can get a little overwhelming, so I'll just direct you to focus on this circled area here. Oh, and I'll mention that also the letters on top of the points represent habitat types. So WC is wet coniferous, WD wet deciduous, TH tolerant hardwood. And so this little circle up here, it contains all of the Canada warbler sites where we had Canada warbler present. So all of those bird communities were actually quite similar because they're grouped together. And so all of the sites you'll notice are WC or WD, so all sites where we detected Canada warbler were either wet coniferous sites or wet deciduous sites. And then all of those sites, or all of the sites that had more than 1 species of conservation concern, so they may be species at risk, or they may be rare species, all of those sites were in wet coniferous vegetation types. And this aligns with research in Nova Scotia, where they found that 40% of all breeding birds at risk in Nova Scotia are found in forested wetlands. So super important for species at risk, biodiversity generally, but really those rare species depend on forested wetlands here and across the Maritimes. And some of those other species of conservation concern that we found were things like the veery, which is a really interesting bird. Their call sounds a bit robotic, and you'll find them in forested wetlands, wet deciduous forests. Northern water thrush is a species that you'll often find with Canada warbler. They tend to be associated with each other. And then, of course, American woodcock is another species of conservation concern, and also one that is harvested in PEI. And so I think that's why it's named in the bird conservation strategy for this region. Forested wetlands are also home to a culturally significant species, the black ash, which has been used by the Mi'kmaq people of this region for thousands of years to make black ash baskets, and other tools and instruments. And we do have a project underway with Woodlot Conservation Society and McPhail Woods, where they're doing lots of surveys across the island to find out where black ash is, and they're hoping to restore some of those populations by doing some tree planting and other restoration activities. Oh, and I should mention that this is Elder Fran Jadis, and he is a very well-known basket maker from Woodlot PEI and Woodlot First Nation PEI, and he hosted this basket making workshop a couple of years ago that I got to participate in, and it was amazing. He's an excellent craftsperson and just a great human overall. And forested wetlands are also home to many rare plants. I couldn't list all of them here today, but I thought I'd share a few of my favorite. Showy lady slipper. I'm sure you've all seen the pink lady slipper. We actually have 3 varieties. This is showy lady slipper, then we also have the yellow lady slipper, which is quite rare. So this one really likes to keep its feet wet. You'll often find it in wet sites. Well, not often. It is rare, so not that often actually. Cloudberry, which is a very uncommon species. You'll find a lot of it in Newfoundland. They've got cloudberry jam. I wouldn't make jam with it here because you wouldn't find enough to probably make a jar for yourself. But I did find this specimen in a protected area in Wood Islands on an Island Nature Trust property. And I know that Gary Schneider has visited this plant, and some of the cloudberry that they're growing at McPhail Woods is from this plant. And also royal fern is another species you might find in wet areas. It's more of an uncommon fern. It's kind of got these very delicate leaves, so it doesn't look like any other species of fern in PEI. So these can be very challenging ecosystems to work in. This is a photo of my colleague that I took when we were doing bird surveys in a bog up west. It was extremely buggy. So he's not having a great time, but even though they're really challenging ecosystems to work in, they're often the most interesting. I love to get into a forested wetland and see what's around. There's always some really interesting bird activity, and you never know what you're going to find. So if you ever get a chance to go in one, I highly recommend. Definitely wear a bug net. And so beyond the sort of biodiversity benefits we receive from forested wetlands, they also provide many services to us. So they're often in headwater areas, so they often have streams flowing through them, so they actually contribute significantly to the base flow of streams. They play a vital role in filtering our air and water, because both as a forest and a wetland, they have like double the power to filter those things, so they're very important for that reason. They also act as a strong defense during storms and flooding. So it's kind of counterintuitive, I guess, to think that a wetland can absorb more water, but they actually act as giant sponges. Whenever we get a big storm like Fiona, they can absorb all of that water so that it doesn't overflow and flood your basement or a road nearby. And they have very significant carbon sinks. So they have their capacity to store carbon is much greater than the edge of the wetland or in upland habitats. So they're very, very important. They're key to our climate change strategy to protect them. They do face many pressures, so from land development, of course, which would destroy or degrade the habitat. Wood harvesting can impact forested wetlands. Not all wood harvesting, but without adequate buffers around forested wetlands, it can change the hydrology of the site. And invasive species, which I know Clay is going to touch on today, can definitely reduce the biodiversity. And also there's emerald ash borer, which we're going to hear more about, is threatening our ash species, which of course white ash and black ash can, well, certainly white ash can be more of a component in forested wetland canopies in western PEI. And it just really reduces that structural complexity, which I talked about being so important for so many different species. So yes, they face many pressures. They are protected, though, in PEI under the Environmental Protection Act, the Watercourse and Wetland Protection Regulations. All wetlands in PEI are protected with a 15-meter no development buffer. And so for wetlands, those buffer zones are counted from the edge of the wetland boundary. And when I mentioned the sort of 3 components of a wetland, the wetland vegetation, when you're delineating a wetland, you're going right to the edge of where you'll find that hydrophytic vegetation. So if you have sphagnum moss and sensitive fern right up into the edge of the boundary, that's where your boundary stops. It stops where the water-loving vegetation stops and the non-water-loving vegetation begins. that's your wetland boundary, and that's where the buffer begins. So how can folks like yourself help forested wetlands? Well, one first great step is just being able to identify them on your own property and making sure that you leave at least a 15-meter buffer around them. And if you aren't sure, the province does have lots of tools to help you figure that out. This is from a web page. If you just type in PEI wetland delineation, a website will come up, and there's some links here that can help you. There's a wetland inventory, so this shows all of the mapped wetlands that we have in PEI. Historically, wetlands have been delineated from aerial photography, and so that presents a bit of a challenge for forested wetlands, because when you're looking down on a wetland, if there's a big obvious pond, you can say, yep, that's a wetland. But if it's just trees and it's wet underneath, there may be an opportunity for it to be mistaken as just a forest and not a wetland. And so that has historically been an issue where people don't realize they have a wetland because it's not appearing on that map. The province is trying to deal with that challenge. We now have a map, you'll see here, of potential development restrictions. So this is a map that shows depths to water table mapping. So this is where they used LIDAR, and I forget what that acronym means. If anyone in the crowd does, shout it out. But it's when you're flying a plane over and you're shooting light down at the ground, and it's recording everything it's meeting on its way down. And so it's actually able to tell us how high the water table is in that area or across the province. So we now have depth to water table data for the whole province. It's currently being ground truthed by my colleague Trent McSwain. And so that map is on there as well. So that can help you identify areas that may be wetland that aren't on that wetland inventory map. We also have a wetland brochure and this new wetland checklist, which is just a two-sided page that asks you some kind of common sense questions, I suppose. It asks you if there are any of these common wetland plants. Are there any low spots where water collects or the ground is soggy for at least a week during the spring? Are there watermarks or stains on trees? Are there any plants like this present? So cattails, sedges, rushes, sphagnum moss, etc. And so it's asking you these series of questions, and at the end, if you have answered yes to any of them, they're saying you may have a forested wetland and you should contact the department. So this is a new tool that we're hoping folks will use so that we can avoid some of those conflicts in the future. And just some final thoughts. Forested wetlands are our most biodiverse ecosystems in PEI. They are very important for our species at risk and for rare species. They occupy a relatively small area of our landscape, but they provide so much value to us, both in biodiversity values and all of those ecosystem services I mentioned. So it's very important as landowners who have control over your own land to consider forested wetlands in your land management decisions. And that is it for me. I'm happy to take any questions.